I wanted a class devoted just to the last lab 13. And it's challenging. As I mentioned, I'm going to be very lenient as far as grading goes, so do your best. But I want to give you every chance to succeed in this, so I want to spend a lab, or not a lab, but a lecture talking specifically about this. And let's review what the lab is to do. So you're going to create a PHP page that has a text box for name. And again, this should look like a completed web page. As the user types each character using AJAX, call a PHP script that retrieves all the customers from the database that you used in Lab 11, whose name matches the characters that were entered. But it doesn't have to be an exact match. So if the users key in DA, for example, it would match Davis and Adams. Because you notice DA is included both there and there. So that you're going to enter the data on the page and you're going to make an AJAX request. And you're going to send to a server-side code to a PHP script, to a PHP script that does a database query and looks for things, customers that matches that particular string, whose name matches that particular string. And it's going to return a list of them. And then you're going to format them and display them in a nice little table, or however you decide to display them. A table is probably the best way to do that. All right. So I always think it's a good idea to take inventory of what you know, or at least what we've covered in class, right, before. What we haven't covered in class, and where we've covered in class something like it, but not exactly the same. Okay, so there's really three parts of making an AJAX process. And there's the client side and the server side. First step is that you're going to format the request. Format and make client is going to, first step, format and make request. And it's going to do that when the user presses a key inside the text box. So every key that's pressed is going to send a request to the server. We've seen that. We've seen that in the AJAX examples. We've seen that in the dictionary example last time. In fact, we actually saw making a request not just based on clicking a button, but when the key is released up, we saw making a request to the server. And as far as passing stuff on the query string, we've seen how to do that as well. So this part, I'm not going to say it's easy because I know you're just learning this stuff. But this part we've covered several examples of. All right, so this is probably the simplest part of the whole exercise. Number two is the server doing its thing. And what it must do is it must make a query using like instead of equal to, and then return a list. Well, have we made queries before? Yes, we have. Although I'm going to talk about making a different kind of query today, and we'll explain the reasoning behind that as well. So we've done database queries, not exactly like these, and we didn't use a like. So this part, we've done similar things, but not exactly. Returning a list, I would suggest returning delimited data. So separate the data by colons, semicolons, any character which does not appear in the customer's data you can use. It's fair play. And finally, this data gets returned to the client. Then in step 3, formats the data. If you use delimited data here, this is like the dictionary example. You're going to separate different rows in the result set and separate into the different fields using the split command. So one I'm not going to talk about. Two I am going to talk about. And I'm going to talk about making a database query a different way using the like. Now, why am I doing that? Well, it is a more secure way of doing it. There are things, I don't know if any of you have heard of what's called a SQL injection attack. A SQL injection attack is where a hacker, whenever there's data that could be entered into the form, can maliciously put in part of a SQL statement. And if you're not very careful about how you handle the data that comes from the form, it's possible they can get to execute that data, that statement, that SQL statement. If you're interested in more information, here's a thing that talks about SQL injection work, along with a little cartoon. And they show if we do something very simple, like just form query as a string, we can add on something to the end of the query thing, to the end of the query string, and maliciously get it executed on the server. So we're going to prevent that. So what we used in the first example, which I'll bring up my first example here, is we used an extension of the PHP language called MySQL which stands for MySQL Improved. Why you notice we have these functions MySQL. That's built in or added to the PHP language and allows us to do database interactivity. This is more vulnerable than the second method, which we're going to use today, which is using what's called PDO. PDO stands for PHP Data Objects. So let's look at an example of that. It's going to look very similar because it's doing the same thing, right? We put the same connection parameters here. Oh, I'm looking at the wrong. Am I looking at the wrong one? Oh, no, I'm looking at the right one. We have the same connection parameters here, and I will comment one thing. You should not use root within your PHP programs. We did it just sort of as a shortcut, but root by definition is all powerful in the database, and you would want to restrict the user that you have. But since this really isn't a class in MySQL administration, I didn't want to go to the trouble of creating another user with different permissions and so on. But just as an FYI, don't use root in a real example. Then create an object. Called MySQL object. using those parameters. So MySQL I is the name of our pipeline for our PDO database objects, PHP database objects. I look to see if there's an error. If there's an error, I display an error message. I set some parameters as far as reporting errors in SQL. I set the character set. Then I'm going to go and have a monstrous statement to replace any of these special characters inside Q from the query string. And you can copy this as it is. Now, what is this going to do? What we're doing now is called escaping characters. What is the purpose of escaping characters? Let's say someone has the name of O'Reilly. Single quote is used within SQL commands to designate the beginning and ending of strings. Well, that is liable to throw off the database and cause an execution error if you don't handle it some way or another. And the way to handle it is by escaping. It's called escaping the characters, where you put in a special character indicating, hey, that's not a slash that means the end of a SQL statement. That's a slash that we want a slash there because there's a slash in that person's name. That's what this does. So I have my parameter, which is going to come from the query string, but it's going to be escaped with this snippet of code. I then am going to prepare my SQL statement. Now, let's look at what this statement does. Statement is select star from offices. And we've added a where clause in it. What's a where clause? A where clause filters out data. So we can do where clauses based on equal to, we could do greater than or less than. I guess that doesn't really make sense with names, but like if it was a numeric field, we could do greater than or less than. We can do a like. And as I mentioned before, a like is an approximate match. So what do we want it to be matched with? Well, in PHP, there are wildcards that we can put in. So, hope I can write on this. Yeah. Let's say like, and if I just did like, yay, it wouldn't work in the way that I would want it to. It would give me everything that matched exactly DA, and that's not what we want. We want the like. We want it to match, in this particular example, we want it to match anything that starts with DA and ends with anything else. And that's where in SQL Server the % sign comes in. So instead I say, give me things that start with DA % sign, and the % sign is a wildcard. So if I say like DA % sign, that will give me a wildcard, and it will give me the things that begin with that string. Remember, we're getting that string from the query string, all right? But we want to match it if the city matches what was in the query string plus anything else after it. Now you have a little bit different case, right? Because you need to look for after. about how you do that. It'd be something like this. It looks something like this. You'd first concatenate the start one, and then you'd concatenate to that result the ending that side. It shouldn't be there. If you're stuck with that, and just do it this way. If that's giving you a hard time. So you have my permission to change that part of the assignment and only look for things that begin with the particular letters. But if you want an extra challenge, try it that way. And that's what you're going to put in. Now, this question mark is a parameter, and we're going to fill in that parameter in a minute here. By doing that this way, we're going to avoid the risk of a MySQL injection because we're letting code handle it, and it's going to be wiser if we try to insert something in that's not. So then we bind the parameter. And we give the parameter a name. Doesn't really matter what name we call it. And a parameter. What that's going to do is that's going to take the parameter that we have, which we got from the query string, and it's going to replace question mark in SQL statement. Then we execute it. Again, then get the result. And we loop through each result, sort of like we did before. And we get one row at a time. And we echo values that we want. In this case, I want the city and the phone number of the office. I'm actually going to change the assignment real quick here. If you already have it done, don't worry. But I'm going to change the assignment to say, that it has to be at the beginning. So you can just use the code in my example. Don't have to worry about this bit down here. Let's do this. Now, how is your code going to be different? The only way it's going to be different is it's not going to output HTML code. Do our best job on this is to have a clean separation between what the server does and what the client does. The server is responsible for providing the data, and that's it. The server is not responsible for formatting the data. And therefore, the server doesn't output any HTML. those of you that did it on the first assignment, a lot of you outputted HTML, and I didn't take any points off because, you know, that's cool. You know, you did it, you had the idea of it. But strictly speaking, it's better not to format, let the server format it, but simply send the data, the raw data, over to the client and let the client format it. The reason for that is it's possible that you might use a script in a couple of places. And in one place, the data may be formatted one way. On one web page, it may be formatted one way. On another web page, it might be formatted another way. So if the server returns HTML, you're kind of limited about what you can do because you're stuck with getting that HTML. If the server simply returns data by itself, then the client can choose to format it however it wants to. For example, in this case, I could simply loop through and tell the client might loop through and say, hey, there's 5 customers that match this. You want to see a list of them. In the case of, like, maybe if you were at an extremely large database file, you know, where you wouldn't necessarily want to show all of them every time someone types something in. All right. So the difference between this, oops. So what this is going to do is this is going to return delimited data. So what do I mean by that? I mean, we could, for example, instead of concatenating this, the TD tag, which I'm doing in this example because this is a full web page, I could output no HTML, no HTML, nothing here. Maybe separate the data by a semicolon. Separate the 2 fields from a semicolon and separate each row with a colon. And what would that look like then? That's what I would send back to the client. All right. With just the raw data. All right. No HTML. Now, finally, pardon me. No, this isn't really full-blown JSON. This is just delimited data. What you would do is you would use code like this, similar to what we did in the dictionary example. That's my Mac, where if you click on the desktop, it shows it. So look at the delimited example. And if we look at this, we actually do a split twice. I create an array by splitting based on colon, and I create a second array based on splitting by the semicolon. For each entry in this array, I split it again to get the 2 individual fields. Now, if you wanted to, you could use JSON to do it. You could use JSON to parse it, but then this code's going to look different. This code's going to be a little more involved than what I have here. We have homogeneous data here, which means that every piece of data we're returning is the same. We're returning, in this case, we're returning a name and a phone number. All right. JSON would be more effective if you were returning different kinds of data. Like, for example, in your weather forecast, you know, you had all kinds of stuff. You had sunrise data, you had the precipitation, you had, and there was all a whole mix of stuff. And some things you might have several things. Some things you might only have one. Well, that is very sort of disjoint data. It's not all the same. It's not all formatted the same. Delimited works really fine when you just have simple data like this, where every row that we're returning, every record that we're returning looks the same. All right. That accomplishes the job with the least amount of overhead, because all we need in this case is 2 extra characters along with all the data. If you go JSON or XML, you have to send back a lot more data in addition to your data. You have to send a lot of metadata along with it in order to parse it and format it. So what do you need to change about this? Well, you're pulling from a different table. You're going to look at the name and not the city. This I said we can keep the same. And you're going to loop through and you're going to output different data from the customer. Let's see what I have specified. I want the customer number, customer name, and the phone number. So those 3 pieces of data from the customer table. Do as much of this as you can. Like I said, this is the first time I'm doing this class. This is a challenge. So I'm trying to give you a lot of assistance, trying to talk you through the process, show you similar things that we've done that are like this, and in fact, even give you a good chunk of what the server-side code is going to look like. You just need to change a few things. All right. So do what you can. All right. Dare I say, if you cannot do delimited data, if you're not really sure how that works, then have your server return HTML. I didn't say that out loud. Yeah, but you can do that as a shortcut. You know, do the part of it that you can. The ideal solution would be to return delimited data or JSON or XML. In this case, it's particularly well suited to delimited data because, again, homogeneous data. But if you want to return HTML from the server side, that's okay. That's still a great accomplishment to do this. This really brings together everything that we've done in this class, if you think about it. All right. We have JavaScript to call a function, to make a request, to pull stuff from the form, to change our current page based on some data that we get. All right. That's the JavaScript part. The server-side code, it is a server-side code, is in the server-side code here, and it even includes a database query. And this is one example where you could not do it completely client-side. I had a student one semester talk about my examples and say, well, you could do that all client-side. I said, well, a lot of them that's true, but this is one example you could not do client-side because of the database interactivity. So it's probably the best example of server-side scripting we've had in this class other than the other assignment that did databases. And if you want to incorporate other stuff into it, like jQuery or Bootstrap and all that, have at it. You don't have a final in this class, and you don't have a final project in this class, so you can almost consider this like a final project. Do your best to do a bang-up job on it. And as always, if you have any questions, let me know, and I'll be glad to work through you with this. I'm trying to think if there is anything else I wanted to say about this. Are there any questions? All right. I do want to remind you of the end of semester announcement that I made. Everything must be turned in no later than the end of day 5/8. So 11:59 and 59 seconds on May 8th. Nothing will be accepted after that time unless we've made prior arrangements. All right. I have deadlines to meet, so you have deadlines to meet. I have been flexible throughout the semester as far as your assignments. Students that come and participate, I generally don't deduct points if they're late, but you have to draw the line somewhere. And if you do request extra time and you have a good reason for it, then I will give you an incomplete. And an incomplete is sort of a contract between me and you to say that you will complete the assignments by this time. And there's consequences with it, because if you do not, then you end up getting an F for the class, all right, which is kind of a little bit dangerous. So there are consequences with the incomplete. So yeah, let me know. And again, I draw the line because, again, the line is drawn on me. I'm not sure exactly when our grades are due, but, I have a good chunk of grading to do, starting now until the end of the semester, until the grades are turned in. I have a lot of grading to do. So I want to make sure that you get your stuff in timely to do that. Are there any questions about this?
We also have lab time for next week.
Next week, there's no scheduled lab time. Now, if you want to make an appointment with me, you can. Like if you wanted to say, like, hey, can you come in 10 o'clock on Monday, like our normal lab time, then that's fine. But you have to make a request. And just a reminder, when you make a request, give me a list of times. Say I could make it, Monday until noon, and Tuesday, from 1 till 4 or something like that. Give me a selection of times, and I'll almost certainly find a time to be there. And these appointments can either be in person or via WebEx. I have a slight preference to WebEx because then I can, it's less of an interruption of my day. I can do it wherever I am. But, there are people that prefer to meet in person, and I respect that wish. And if you want me to come in, I'll make arrangements to come in if at all possible. All right, that's all I had today. Enjoyed this class. This class has done more this semester than previous classes semester, so you can pat yourself on the back for that. I think last semester we did the same thing or close to it. But yeah, I was really happy to integrate databases, and I was really happy to see that you were generally very successful in doing those lab assignments, that they didn't throw you too much for a loop. So hope that we can say the same about this one. We'll either see you in lab or we will see you somewhere else. I was going to say next week, but not necessarily. So take care, and let me know if you have any questions.